So welcome. Tonight's Dharma talk starts with a title and then has a couple of subtitles. The title is Yoga and Love, colon, the word for the symbol, not the body part. So Yoga and Love, the biological and spiritual imperatives on the human journey. And the second subtitle is about forgiveness. Self-forgiveness and forgiveness as a larger topic too. So here we'll start. And so you can take a comfortable and quiet seat. We will enjoy silence for the next few minutes together. Join your hands together in Anjali Mudra. Appreciate the efforts that you've made to be here this evening. And we can also appreciate the efforts each other has made. You're welcome to bow your head to your heart. And release your hands and open your eyes. So in the human journey, we are born into this biological reality, and therefore I call these two kind of competing imperatives, the biological and the spiritual imperative. And on the one hand, yoga is helping both of those, both our biological capacity, our health, our resilience, our whole ecosystem is improved by that, and yoga supports our journey as a spiritual being as well. And what I've said before about yoga and love is that we seem to have this quandary where yoga supports us to be the best possible version of ourselves. And we might feel that like as an emanation or radiation out from our hearts and our bodies and minds, and we can even have full-on beautiful loving insight in Shavasana and in meditation, and then go back into human relationship and fumble. We go back to human relationship and meet up with our dilemmas and our conflicts and our habits, because some of the ways that we operate are so reflexive and they seem so powerful, and they are. Some of the habits that we've developed in the mind, which yoga calls samskaras, we developed at such a porous age in life that those habits are older than your new habits. Except that the teachings and the realizations of yoga are older than you are. They're way beyond your lifespan or mine or all of our collective lifespans together. And so the dilemma that we face is this sort of like loving, possible opening event happens, and we feel ourselves to be more capable, more wise, more kind-hearted, but then we see ourselves not acting at our best. And that's disappointing. Has this happened to anybody on occasion? Yeah. So that disappointment sometimes gets usurped by an internal shame language that says something like, I knew you weren't going to do better at this. Or a little shame language that says, see, there you go again. Or, other people really can't be trusted. Or, this always gets messed up. The moment I open my mouth, he or she says, the disappointment starts reinforcing the narrative about human conflict or human shortcoming. Others are our own. And that reinforcement makes the samskaras stronger. So the mind habits get to go deeper, like a wagon rut is how we sometimes describe a samskara. Think about yoga as thousands of years old, and so how they might have described would be a wagon rut rather than like the max tracks, though that's my contemporary analogy. Yet the max tracks don't keep getting deeper, they've established them in a stable manner. A wagon rut was created when a wagon went through muddy terrain enough times that it made a little groove, and then that terrain got hardened, and now each time it rains the water goes into that groove again, and the wagon might fall back into that groove as it comes through and it makes it deeper. So samskaras do get deeper if they're unsupervised. You are the supervisor, by the way, of your own samskaras. If the habits go unnoticed or untended to, if we don't get curious about the habits, they will on their own get deeper. Which is to say, we will then, on our own unsupervised mind, find ourselves experiencing human suffering. So in the biological imperative, how we are born as humans, we are born into the class of creatures called mammals. It means you have a mammalian brain. Sometimes I like to call that your dog and cat brain. It's in the middle brain for you as a human, also called your limbic brain. My pet word for it, again, is the dog and cat brain, because it's familiar enough, and if any of you have pets or friends with pets, you've seen how important it is to dogs and cats to bond. Unless you have a tortoiseshell cat, then it's not as important for that breed of cat. Anybody notice that? Torties like to be loners, but we have 2 gray tabbies at home. They're like Velcro. Like they put their paws on your cheeks and look at you to wake you up in the morning. Like they're all about snuggling and being close, and they are tracking our behaviors. They know the sound of the doorknob from the bedroom, and there they are. They might have been sound asleep, but they just heard the doorknob and they come in the morning. So our mammalian brain, which is what we were born with, and again into the class of animals called mammals, it wants us to connect. Our survival depends on our ability to attach with others, and to attach to our care providers really specifically, to attach to people who will, when we are most helpless, and that is, you're born into the condition of helplessness as an infant. You don't feed yourself, you don't walk yet, you don't speak, you don't meet your own needs yet. As my friend Gabor Mate said about helplessness, he said, when we're infants, and as we're born as humans, we have no trouble asking for help. We cry out, we're asking for help. We try to get eye contact, we're asking for something. We avert our gaze, we're asking for something. We move in a certain way, we're crying out for help. We don't have any trouble asking for help when we're born. We start having trouble asking for help when we get conditioned mind overwhelming our instinct. So you're born in this relatively helpless and adorable state. One of the reasons I think infants are so cute, and evolution saw to this, is that the grown people don't want to see them suffer. So adorability factor goes up, and the urge to care for the infant increases in the grown people. Have you seen this when you have young ones? Even strangers want to care for your babies, right? So we're born in this sort of helpless and adorable condition that needs other people to attach to us so that we are taken care of by them. And if we get attachment that's attuned to us, we learn to meet our needs and to feel like we belong. We feel like we have a place in the family of things, to quote Mary Oliver. That's from her poem, The Wild Geese. And if we're born into a circumstance where there's just enough stress or just enough misattunement or just enough disquiet or maybe a family event or a historical event or a community event, we don't get the same sense of belonging or nurturance. We might get some of our basic needs met, but we can also get an inadvertent message that we don't quite fit, we don't quite belong, or that some of our needs are challenging to our care providers, and we learn to put those needs aside. People learn to suppress all kinds of things to maintain the main attachment sources of support. You can suppress your playfulness or your rage, but also your physical appetite, or suppress your bookishness or your athleticism because somebody else isn't really promoting that in you. They want a different kind of child. So we learn to mold ourselves so that we can keep attaching to keep surviving. One time when Jay and I were giving this talk in Cannon Beach, he called that the original self-betrayal. Would you mind talking about that for a few minutes? How we start shaping ourselves to make sure we don't get left behind in the wild.
Well, we're always learning from others, especially when we're younger, that's our primary function is to learn, of course. But when what we're doing isn't fitting what the parents want us to do, the example I always use is the terrific twos. That we have come to call children in that age range terrible, and I'm pretty sure there's never been a terrible 2-year-old. So what is the terribleness? It's simply put that we're inconvenient to the parents. The parents in a hurry, we're not in a hurry. I'm hungry, the parent doesn't want to feed me. I don't want to eat that, they want to feed me that, and so on. And so, in the face of that and being compelled instinctively to attach, we can't overpower the parents. So we suppress or compress ourselves. We change something in ourselves, and that becomes more distant from what our nature is. That it is a betrayal of what our basic nature is. And when that becomes a habit, then I would think of that as being a samskara too, a little bit broader than the individual samskaras. But so that, to me, that's that self-betrayal that ends up being one of our core challenges through the course of our lives. But if that gets so deeply ingrained, to me, that's the root of most of the struggles we'll have. We may have various symptoms that we're treating as a consequence of that, but that's the core or the root of the struggles that we're going to have through the course of a lifetime, the way I look at it anyway.
Yeah, and so yoga would call that moment avidya. If the 2-year-old had consciousness, since 2-year-olds don't generally have cognitive mind yet, when I refer to avidya here, I want to put it into context. So the first cause of suffering and the most painful cause of suffering is called avidya. It means forgetting your basic nature. Tomorrow morning I'll unpack the causes of suffering quite a bit more, and I'll talk about also the sources of joy. But right there we start compromising or compressing or suppressing parts of who we are. We don't really know that we're doing that. It's not a cognitive choice. You don't have cognition yet, so you can't make a cognitive strategy about it. It's a biological imperative to shape so that you're not putting yourself at risk. And it's wholly appropriate that infants are self-centered and need to get their needs met, but the sense of self isn't yet established. Not even the small s self, much less the capital S self. So again, it's not a cognitive strategy, but as cognition comes on board a few years later, and as you start to be able to think even more independently, let's say about adolescence, you can start having a really deep story. What's wrong with me? There is something terribly and intrinsically wrong with me. Because now I have a self-story based on my need to compromise from earlier in my life. And I've shaped myself to be out of alignment with my basic nature. And yet I'm not wholly in alignment with the world around me. I am, after all, an adolescent struggling to find out what this is all about. And my brain doesn't quite have full-on cognition, but hormones are racing, and part of that feels like anxiety about who we are and how we're going to fit in. And we start to have this big flush. How many of you really enjoyed middle school? Let me just check. Okay, how about high school cliques? Did you enjoy that? No. And now our teenage population has all that social media influence as well. But we're having another big brain development right there, in which we are facing the biological imperative and the spiritual imperative. It's with you your whole life spectrum, but you really start to become aware of the spiritual imperative as you realize there's a sense of self in here, there's a somebody in here. And who is it? Like re-examining your life, like Mary said she's going to be doing. So if you think about that happening periodically as you get to have a sense of self in the world, you are asking, well, who am I and who am I meant to become? In our culture, we're also told to figure out what you're going to do with your life, which means like your career more than your dharma. What are you going to do with your life is a pretty big pressure to put on a teenager or a young adult even. So our biological imperative, let's say, how does it go awry if we don't have good circumstances? I was describing some of that before, where it's misattuned or chaotic or neglectful and so on. Even if you had good circumstances. And I appreciate Eckhart Tolle clarifying this in his book, A New Earth, where he said, even if you were born to perfect parents, you weren't born into a perfect culture. You weren't born into the ideal circumstances for a human being, because our culture reflects the samskaras of generations and generations of habit. And if you were born into a Western culture, you're born into materialism and consumerism and individualism, to the extent that we actually forget our sense of belonging, innate belonging. So that biological imperative sets you up to look for attachment for your survival. And it also tells you to first look for the threat. This is so fundamental. Your brain has a higher percentage of real estate allotted to look for the threat than it does to look for the pleasant. For example, if this was generations back and you happened to find a ripe mango on a tree somewhere and felt like, oh, it's so delicious, your need to remember that ripe mango would be far fewer percentage of need in your brain compared to remembering where the tiger was last seen. Do you understand what I mean by that? Your brain would be much more preoccupied with the tiger's lair and making sure that you strategize not to upset the tiger. And then it would have a few extra brain cells to say, and where was that mango? Now you're going to hunt and gather and look for food for survival, but in terms of exquisite pleasure, your brain percentage from early development as a human species was on survival, primary survival, primitive survival, biological survival. So you hear a rustling in the leaves, it's a tiger. Could have been the wind. But your brain first will think tiger so that it promotes your ability to get away from there. And so that kind of, if you just live by the biological imperative and we lose sight of the spiritual imperative, you get this spectrum. So the biological need to attach and survive. If there's a threat, you go to fight, flight, freeze, or submit reactions. Those are helpful if there's actually a threat. But so often the threats are actually our own thoughts. Might be somebody else's facial expression, but it's your thought about their facial expression. It might be your bank account, but it's your thought about the bank account. It could be traffic, and those are real threats sometimes. Somebody driving poorly, and you realize that you're actually under a moment of anxious arousal. Your biological system took care of that. Now going on to call that person an idiot, and to keep reinforcing that they're an unhelpful human being, that's unnecessary regurgitation. But you keep the fight-flight system still on alert when you do that. To say to the person who drove poorly and exacerbated your nervous system, to say, may all beings be safe and well, it reduces your fight-flight reaction. So you go to like metta practice. So the threat producing the fight, flight, freeze, submit reaction then quickly stirs what we call here in this yoga training, we call it the 6 stations of the mind. So now your mind is going to be consumed with self and other, like the lousy driver that you feel affronted by, and you tell the story about the other, and the otherness of the other is rejectionable to you. You tell a story about yourself as a good driver, or a person who's victimized by bad drivers. You can get caught in that thought loop, self and other, also past and future. The last time somebody did that on the freeway, I had this experience. The next time I'm driving, I'm going to have to watch out for. And you have likes and dislikes. I really prefer people drive like this. I prefer they don't drive like that. In fact, those sorts of people, are very dislikable to me because they're so disrespectful of other human life. You can really blow it up and spiritualize it if you want to. But those 6 stations of the mind, they keep you going in a web of sorts that quickly obscures the present moment awe and beauty and the possibility of love and forgiveness. Because the 6 stations are so compulsive about your survival, they obscure your ability to remember. And they keep you promoting, rather than using the diaphragm to breathe, you go to stress muscles to breathe. So that's pec minor and scalenes and upper trapezius and thoracic, intercostal. So you're now chest breathing to go with your thoughts, to go with your original arousal. And you're creating a biochemical soup on the inside of this whole system. That biochemical soup doesn't digest well, doesn't fight off the flu very well, and doesn't have a good endocrine balance. So because when your body's actually under threat, it suppresses digestive, immune, and endocrine function. It's promoted automatically to suppress those. So there's your biochemical soup, and you now have health problems, mental and psychological and physical. So this is if the biological imperative is all we know and all we're consumed with. And I just want to make a note that some of the citizens in our world, that is all they know, and that's all they're consumed with. That they don't get basic needs met, and part of that is our responsibility for those of us who do have basic needs met. The health crisis that we have is a social justice issue. It's not an issue of individuals lacking willpower or knowledge. It's a capacity issue for all of us as a community. So when I look at health problems for any one of us, I'm asking, where did we kind of go awry here on the biological imperative taking over and forgetting how the spiritual imperative promotes health and saves our lives? Before I talk about the other side of this spectrum, are there any questions about what I've said about the biological imperative, and or has anybody lived that? That looks like stress and anxiety and sleeplessness and poor digestion and hormone imbalances and chronic pain and headaches. Has anybody lived that? Yeah, some of you, this is the facial gesture and the sigh of recognition, is that right? Mm-hmm. One of the challenges is that when you're living on this cycle here, you try to solve the problem from here. Has that worked? No. Because what can happen on this side of the spectrum is the plans you're making out of anxiety or fear. And some of us make the plan from this biological imperative, we make that plan out of shame, which is mixed with anxiety and fear. But the plan we might make to improve our digestion, for example, might be like the newest diet going around. But we're making the plan in reaction to the biological imperative causing a breakdown in our system, rather than in response to the deep indwelling drive for your body intelligence to promote health and love and harmony and compassion. So if you think of yourself as more like an alchemist working with the resources that are actually given to you as a human, the internal resources of body intelligence and wisdom and intuition, we work with those to make decisions to heal this biological system. But we're coming from the side of this grease board that's on the spiritual imperative. Let's say that you have insomnia and you want to solve it from anxiety and fear. So a person starts thinking midday, I hope I get a good night's sleep tonight. I really need some sleep. And they keep perseverating on how important sleep is going to be, and the fear of not getting the sleep. And then the system is getting more anxious about the sleep. And then they're making plans. Maybe they have good sleep hygiene prescription, and so they start doing the sleep hygiene things, but very anxiously doing them. Like, and now I turn off the computer an hour before bedtime, and now I have the Ayurvedic beverage, and now I have the pranayama, and now I remember to do my mantra, and now I do this, and now I do that. But the urge to do it is coming from anxiety or fear, and it doesn't end up working. Then they can say, oh, that doesn't work either. Nothing is going to help me. Do you understand how I'm describing? You want to add anything? No. So fortunately, we're also born with this spiritual imperative, and I like to say fortunately because my sense is you're all magnetically pulled enough to the spiritual imperative that you're here. And so you've heard it either haunting your life for you to return its call, or you've had a wake-up call, like my friend Will Pye, who was here last night and will be here tomorrow morning. His wake-up call was a brain tumor and also depression earlier in his life. So you've either gotten an instant wake-up call, something urgent arose, or you got haunted by this urge to know, who am I and why am I here and what's meant to come through me? And it might have been haunting you long enough that you're now on a spiritual path or coming back to a spiritual path. So the spiritual imperative is actually, we do have an urge as a human organism to individuate or to differentiate, to be raised in a little pod, a mammal pod, a little family, like a pack of wolves. We are raised like this, but then we're meant to differentiate and to outgrow that pod and become an individual who has unique expression and whose dharma comes through him or her. Some of that outgrowing, you start to see it in adolescence, where the individuation looks like the hand. This isn't the case in our household, but I know it in other households. There's different ways teenagers differentiate, and certainly we see that with Ryan and Jason, but some teenagers got this phrase of like, talk to the hand. Right? So they're pushing their parents away while still needing their parents. Pushing away but also wanting to rely on. And that is part of where we start with the friction of differentiation, where we do still need to be attached. And we are attached because now we've had this 12 or 13 or 14 years in the human system of our family. Even if it wasn't a great family circumstance, We are attached, and we're looking to also detach or differentiate and to know who we are, and to dress in our own style, and to pierce our bodies the way we want to pierce them, and to have haircuts that we can enjoy, and to find our expression somewhere, to have our agency get realized, and to be able to make a difference in our own lives. To have our first job, and our first love, and our first automobile, and our first adventure out beyond the certain physical radius, right? Weren't those exciting times? None of you in the room right now is a teenager, but you can remember. Some of you are closer to your teenage years than I am, which is fun to see. You're already interested in the Dharma. So that process was an important process for us to go through. And it's still the case that we need others. For our entire life spectrum, we are other dependent. We aren't independent animals. We were born dependent, and we are dependent and interdependent for the entire life spectrum. Our culture heavily emphasizes, to our expense, it heavily emphasizes independence. And we see some of the breakdown of that when there's illness or addiction, that people become judged or they isolate. They might become marginalized or forgotten. We also see it in our senior population. We promoted independence, and then we promote isolation. We don't have a good care system for our full life spectrum, for who we are as humans. We got distracted by the biological imperative and then the materialism and consumerism imperatives. So rather than that, here on the spiritual side of this grease board, we're looking at how we individuate in order to thrive, but remembering that we still need attachment, we still need relationship, we still need connection. But you have all of this is true. You need to attach, you need to survive, you need to individuate, and you long to thrive. And when you're not thriving, you're suffering. You might suppress your knowledge of that, but when a human being isn't thriving in his or her expression, when the Dharma can't come through, there is a measure of suffering there. A person can go to sleep to that, which we call avidya, forgetting your basic nature, forgetfulness, that something was meant to express itself through you. One of the most fundamentals for that is love. If there's a threat, and you're on the spiritual imperative, a threat or a perceived threat, one of the first responses that we recommend is curiosity. And mindful curiosity. So mindful curiosity is different than just curiosity. How do you think it might be different? Curiosity or mindful curiosity? What do you think the difference might be?
Well, curiosity would be when you're interested in something without thinking about whether or not you should be interested in it or why you're interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you look at a girl on the street or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
without thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's almost like a chemical reaction with that kind of curiosity too, and you can feel that there's like your biochemistry is participating there too. Yeah. Yes.
Mindful curiosity is intentional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's an intentionality that's like holding that curiosity. It's a little bit wider. So even the curiosity that you're talking about, Stacy, is like, how will I get my needs met? Curiosity, or how will I avoid that person? What's going to happen in this dynamic? Curiosity, and then mindful curiosity has a wider container, like, how is it that we come to be in this moment together? What might I be able to learn here about myself and my instincts, and about the quote-unquote otherness of the other that is actually also an embodiment of the same source that's me. You were going to say, Tommy?
I was just going to say, if it's mindful, then you have others' needs in mind, not just your own.
Yeah, it's like more whole. And it preserves the sense that there's connection or relationality or reciprocity already happening, rather than going into the isolation that humans can do. And we're curious about how we either mess that up or how we we need to tell that person that they're wrong, or we need to improve ourselves because of our deficits, or we have to improve them somehow. And that kind of curiosity is spent on examining the other person or over-examining yourself, and it constricts you. But as you were talking about curiosity, it awakens or expands you. And it has a more long-term interest. Short-term curiosity is more like short-term decision-making based on like an instinct right there. And short-term decisions keep repeating themselves because they go back to your biological imperative. A long-term decision is based on mindful curiosity. Here's a concrete example. Somebody is in despair and makes a short-term decision. Let's say it's food despair, because I specialize in that particular topic, at food addiction and eating disorders and so on. So let's say it's food despair. The short-term decision that they might make is, I will never eat this food again because it's too problematic for me. And that prohibits curiosity. Long-term decision-making in response to a food compulsion gets really curious about what's underlying the food issue and how might I make decisions towards wholehearted recovery, not just preserving myself from a few more moments of discomfort or from the angst that I'm experiencing now. So short-term decision-making, you get the same outcome generally again and again, and long-term decision-making will need your mindful curiosity to sustain it. Short-term decision-making, a decision gets made and the curiosity often closes down. Long-term decision-making from mindful curiosity, the options keep expanding. And we experience the difference between contraction and expansion. But somebody else was going to say something about curiosity or mindful curiosity, and I missed you.
I think I was going to say that the first thing I thought of was the phrase, curiosity kills the cat. And I was like, trying to imagine, like, what kind of curiosity kills the cat? But all I can think of is my 3-year-old, and he's very curious, and he would definitely die from curiosity, and I wasn't there to be like, that's not a good idea to be curious in that particular way that you're doing it, and you have to have a bit more wisdom, like, you know, seeing danger if there's threat, and knowing not to just be curious about threat.
Yeah, yeah. So in the case of, let's say, when I say threat here, I should be clear, I'm referring to interpersonal human threat, because we're talking about yoga and love, and generally we're looking at other humans for that process. And so let's say there's a 3-year-old about to cross the street because he's curious about the fire hydrant over there. Yeah, definitely not a good idea to let that curiosity wander off into the wild of traffic by itself. So here, if I'm putting this into relational dilemmas, a perceived threat comes in, and you are mindfully curious about either your relationship to yourself or the interpersonal relationship that's actually going on. And we stay open enough that we contact what I call the sources of joy, which I'll be unpacking for you tomorrow morning in the other Dharma talk. So mindfulness takes you into the possibility of new responses, fresh responses. And it lets you stay open to the possibility that your perspective isn't the only one, nor is it always right, and it might even be outdated, including your perspective on yourself and how you have to respond to this relational perceived threat. To consider that your response might be outdated is to say to yourself, I wonder if these samskaras are still useful to me. This one that guards or reacts or hides or aggresses or judges, is this samskara still useful to me? And I wonder what might happen if I lessened my reliance on this samskara by even just a few degrees. Or if I lengthened the time frame between reaction and response, what might happen with that? How might the circumstance be seen differently if my system weren't on high arousal because I perceived a threat? So if we get to have hang time, which I like to call it, in mindful curiosity, you're sort of hovering between reaction and response, you will likely realize the sources of joy are already available. The For example, the first source of joy is called awe, coming back to awe. And by awe, I don't mean that you're awestruck about the dumbness of other humans. People are sometimes in awe of somebody else's stupidity. That isn't a good use of the word awe. When I talk about awe, I mean really to come with awe to the moment that exists right now. And remember the indwelling earnestness of the other human. And the innocence. And the possibility that this moment in which you've interacted, perceived or real threat, could be also a moment for transformation. And without that perceived threat, you may not have the chance for that kind of transformation. It has been said that all species evolve under pressure. So we actually need sometimes the rubbing up against somebody else and the perceived or real threat. It may simply be that opportunity for somebody else just became your teacher, your awe teacher, your mindful curiosity teacher. And to rest in that, you start to breathe again with your diaphragm. This might seem very pragmatic, and I think there's pragmatics under your capacity, so I will name it again. Your digestive, immune, and endocrine systems start working better. Now, what does that mean for you spiritually? Digestion is more than food. It's also knowledge and insight and life events. We digest experiences. Your brain is trying to digest those experiences you're having all the time, but so too is your gut. And so incoming food, incoming knowledge, incoming information, incoming stimulus, it's all needing the digestive process that we think of in the physical body as incoming nourishment, gets digested and transformed into usable and non-usable materials. Do I have to be more obvious? You want to be more obvious?
Yeah.
So both usable and non-usable materials. So what's usable has to be able to be absorbed. Well, if anybody in the room has any knowledge about the gut, you know that it doesn't do very well. If you have low absorption for any reason in your gut, eating a really high-end diet doesn't matter that much. If you can't absorb the nutrients, they're just going into the non-usable, they're getting ejected. They're just going right through you. So if you don't have good absorption, if you suffer from malabsorption, buy cheaper food. I mean, don't waste your resources on just eating like really high-end food, trying to get the malabsorption fixed from that perspective. We actually have to address the absorption capacity that your gut has. And part of that is a gut-brain axis issue. So if you think about what can you absorb even then mentally, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, if you can't absorb the teachings that are coming your way, you might need to work on absorption, not more teachings. I mean, keep coming to teachings because you're osmotically getting something. Even if you're not absorbing, you can have how the skin takes in the lotion, you know. So you're absorbing by being here. But I want to highlight that you take in information, nourishment, experiences, conflicts, insight, relational turbulence, relational joy, and you want to digest it. That will work better if your spiritual imperative is in alignment with you. And you'll eject the non-usable, the non-necessary, the non-nutritive. You don't have to carry all that baggage around. It's just not the case that every person you have a perceived conflict with needs you to have a one-on-one interpersonal session. Some of them are less important, and you learn what you can from it, and then you let it go downstream. Your immune system will also work better, and by immunity here I mean your psychosocial, spiritual immunity also. So that rather than being oversensitive to all incoming stimulation, being too porous is not better than being too rigid or too guarded. You want to have a kind of helpful, elegant porousness so that you can sometimes use that porousness to allow in, and other times you don't allow in. There are some viruses or toxic energies on the planet you don't have to keep exposing yourself to when your system isn't able to have resilience for those. For me, when I was a child, going to the arcade where they had all the video games and it was really super noisy in there, total meltdown. not my place. For other people, totally fun. For me, I haven't ever done this, but I imagine if I had hours on Facebook, I would be like depleted and collapsing under my pillow. I haven't exposed myself to that kind of stimulation because my brain doesn't do it that well, and it hasn't been important enough. But it's to say, what do you expose yourself to? What do you lessen your exposure to? And know what your resilience is. And let's call, for now, resilience and immunity a synonym. Because you're looking at, what are you exposed to all day long? And what's come in, if any of that's toxic, how much room do you have left for the benevolent, the gracious, the beautiful, the loving, or the kind? If your system is weighed down by toxicity, you have less availability, fewer receptor sites for awe and joy and love. And you have to kind of work on getting the residue to leave. Getting the residue resolved, as it were. Do you understand what I mean by this? Is there anybody in the room whose life is overexposed to toxicity on a daily basis? Mm-hmm. A couple of habits that I never picked up again after living at Brighton Bush Hot Springs. I don't need my phone to ring. It's always on silent. In fact, I didn't get a telephone for many, many years after leaving Brighton Bush. I didn't have an answering machine. I didn't rejoin that part of our culture. I do now have a phone and I do use it, and I'm sure sometimes I'm using it more than I would recommend to myself. But it doesn't ring. It doesn't have a sound on for even a text message. And I like airplane mode frequently. I also did not pick up the habit of listening to the news, and I don't. I drive in silence and we don't have the radio blaring the news at the house. I never picked up the habit of going back to TV, commercials. There's just some stimulations that I didn't have to return to. I forgot to pick up the habit of materialism. I have enough. Okay, I've got the basics taken care of, but I don't go shopping. I'm so grateful for internet shopping, actually, to buy the things I need to buy without leaving the house. I don't go to the mall. I don't go where there's throngs of people milling about doing little to nothing except buying. These are my choices. I'm not saying they have to be your choices, but know what you're exposed to and diminish the exposures you can diminish. The unnecessary ones are actually burdening you just enough. Maybe outside of your conscious awareness, but just enough. I'm sure I could go on with my list of things that got surrendered at Brighton Bush and didn't get picked back up, but I'll leave it at that for now. So your endocrine system, when that starts to function better, your capacity for creativity, sensuality, aliveness, your relationship to nature will improve. Your ability for spontaneity will return. The sense of adventure in life comes back. Your hormones are working again. The second chakra is a part of that process, and you awaken this sense of life wants to thrive in you and through you. And that's much more satisfying and likely to support that dharma that's going to come through you. The endocrine system is responsible for so much beyond what you might think of mate and procreate nervous system. So by the way, this is rest and digest, tend and befriend, mate and procreate. If you want pet names for your nervous system, those are them. I didn't make them up. I'm just letting you know they exist. So rest and digest, tend and befriend, mate and procreate. And the endocrine system is worth more than just mating and procreating. It's beyond that. But the sense of aliveness in the body, the radiance in your eyes, your ability to sleep and sleep deeply through the night and wake up feeling refreshed. All of that comes back when you're living more in alignment with this spiritual imperative, and your adrenaline goes down, your cortisol levels go down in the sense of health. Over here we've got higher adrenaline and elevated cortisol levels. Now it balances out and you find yourself increasing your capacity to express the natural qualities of the human heart, those that are most innate to us, which yoga calls the Brahmaviharas. It means divine abodes, the divine homes of the heart. And rather than those feeling like practices you have to adopt, they feel like the natural expression. In the meantime, we practice. We adopt them as inner teachers. So the good news is there's reciprocity all along the way between your biological and your spiritual imperative. And the good news is you can do something about this whole spectrum anytime, anywhere, by coming into mindful curiosity and diaphragmatic breathing. That might seem a little too simple, but it's actually scientifically demonstrated now. So not only is yoga a household word, but so is mindfulness. And I think we're on the brink of neuroscience being a household word as well, which is kind of exciting. So if you forgot to interrupt this anywhere along the spectrum and you found yourself back in the anxious biological imperative, you can adopt one of the Brahmaviharas and go upstream from the bottom of the spectrum and heal. Or you can remember, mindful curiosity. How did I get here? How did I actually get here? Into this moment of anxious biological survival. Which is a really different question than, how did I get here? It's the same words, but the tone and the inflection and the interest is really different. I'm going to ask Jay in a moment to talk about the value of curiosity in love relationships, because his primary work is as a couples therapist. But I want to reinforce, why does mindful curiosity work and why does diaphragmatic breathing work? And I'll reinforce it based on the brain, and then I'll pass it to Jay for a few minutes. In your brain system right here on the biological, your cat and dog brain, if this is out of balance, they're going wild in there. And your amygdala, which acts, as Bessel van der Kolk likes to say, like a smoke detector, is alarming the dog and cat constantly. And that's messaging your lower brain, your lizard brain, your reptilian brain, to change the housekeeping functions for urgency. Not for long-term resilience, but for urgency. And it's pulling offline your neocortex. So at the brainstem we call that your lizard brain. In the middle here I call it your dog and cat brain. And up here I call it your wizard brain because it rhymes with lizard. And this is your neocortex, where we have capacity for wisdom and perspective and so on. So if you're in the biological imperative and you're caught up here, dog and cat going wild, you lose access to the wizard and you promote the lizard to be a lot more anxious. It's really hard to get curious in that moment. In fact, almost impossible. But to go to the possibility of curiosity, which I sometimes like to call the possibility of the possibility of mindful willingness, your neocortex starts to come back online, and the dog and cat look up at the wizard and say, "Thank you." And the lizard looks up and says, "Thanks, I was getting really tired." Using your diaphragmatic breathing also helps to calm your lizard brain down. That's called bottom-up processing. The other one's called top-down processing. So from the neocortex to the dog and cat, from the lizard up to the dog and cat. So the lizard gets to say to the dog and cat, "You know what? I got this. You have misread the circumstance. Let us breathe for a few moments and calm you guys down." And sometimes you might see that in your dog or cat, especially your dog, as a big yawn. And then they're more relaxed. Does your dog yawn?
Yeah, she's very relaxed right now. We were out there messing around for 15-20 minutes because she wouldn't sit in the car. She's like, "Come in."
She wants connection. Part of our imperative, again, as mammals, is to connect. And to do that, we need each other. We need each other's brains. We formed our brains in relationship to other brains. We need each other's brains to help heal. And the brain healing I'm talking about is also your heart. I mean, your psycho-spiritual heart, your mind and your body. But that top-down, bottom-up processing is really very effective. So effective that it's getting studied and researched. Now it's evidence-based. As well, just being able to then, if you say, the possibility of mindful willingness or mindful curiosity with a deep breath, you're quite likely to then remember, the Brahmaviharas could be helpful right now. In this interpersonal dilemma, one of these Brahmaviharas is going to make sense to me. So you're kind of promoting memory of of the spiritual essence of your own heart. It's already in there. Again, like I said, it's your basic nature, but it does need to be promoted or practiced sometimes. Can you talk about curiosity and love in interpersonal relationship, please?
So if we talk about the forgetfulness of our basic nature that we all tend to have over time, we lose, once we've forgotten it, we're not going to be very curious about it. But we're still going to suffer from the absence of that, being in touch with it. And so that's on an intrapersonal basis. And as you said, I work with couples, my primary work. I find that the same thing is present with the couples work, with interpersonal relationships, that when we lose touch with the basic nature of that other person, then we can't relate to them, of course, but we forget almost entirely that is another person, an individual. They become an object, they become somebody that we project our concerns onto. For example, I see these things numerous times a day with working with couples. They will be sitting there in front of me and they're interacting and they're treating each other as if they are adversaries. And they'll actually overtly be cruel to each other. The state of cruelty is something that arises emotionally as anger. Anger I see as being the emotion that's the emotional component of the fight or flight syndrome. It's the emotion for fight. And in that state of mind, in the fight or flight syndrome, our attention is narrowed down very thin. Mm-hmm. And it's very focused on the threat stimulus and our response to it. And the response isn't thoughtful. It's that fast. It's whatever we have programmed on. It's programmed in so tightly, it's like 2 times 2. In learning theory, they call that overlearned. So there's zero curiosity. There's not even room in that kind of thinking for curiosity. So we're treating that object, in this case, a loved one, as the threat, as the stimulus, as an adversary. And so one of the things that I do, that's why this came up in this part of the conversation, is encourage people to have an exploratory or curious relationship to what the stimulus is, that being their loved one. And insofar as we don't do that, we're trapped in, effectively, the lower parts of our brain. And in fact, literally, you can see that lit up in a way that is different from a calm and loving state of mind. You can see these brain scan studies are really cool. You can actually see that literally the different areas of the brain are lit up. One of them is one that's associated with fighting, and another was associated with bonding. It's really fascinating to see how just so clear it is. I mean, I can see it sitting in front of my couch in the office. I know what it is, but there's something about the tangibility of that, the different areas of the actual brain, areas of the brain lit up right down here in a very different way than if you're in the middle of a fight. So to tie it to curiosity, if you wedge the concept of curiosity into that, immediately your brain wants to answer pretty much any question. You throw a question at any brain, and some part of the brain wants to answer it. That's the way human brains are. So you just plug that in there. Immediately you've opened up, you've kind of wedged your way into that, it's not actually instinctive, but overlearned process of perceiving and responding to a threat. So I see that as a basis for opening up everything, opening up our mind, opening up all the possibilities that can exist in our mind, and opening up the possibilities in a relationship. And it happens within the individual, to me, in a systematic way, almost the same as interpersonally. And they both work with a sense of curiosity. Wow, what is this that's going on for me right now? Instead of, oh, there's that, and you just go right into whatever it is. If A, then B. If B, then C. There's not a lot of curiosity in that. If the person has left the laundry in the washing machine instead of taking it out and putting it in that dryer. It's remarkable how consistent some of these patterns are. It's dishwashers. How do you load a dishwasher as a common focus? And everybody knows that that's not really what's going on. They don't care that much, but it becomes a focus point, and all the energy goes right onto that as a symbol. And there's no curiosity in that. How stupid can you be? How many times have I said blah blah blah? You'd sense there's no curiosity in that. There's no sense of openness. There's no sense of exploration. It's razor thin way of being in the world. And so, when we feel that in ourselves, and we become curious about it, wow, what's going on? Where did this come from? Or we see it in another person, or we see ourselves reacting that way to another person, and we just throw in the curiosity. Wow, what's going on here? Or fascination. I love that one. It's fascinating. Wow, this is amazing. This is the most innocuous, mundane phenomenon, and yet there's so much energy around it.
Yeah.
This is just fascinating. Isn't it, honey?
I like to say, I have little bumper sticker phrases that I use. One is fascination before frustration, and the other is curiosity before contraction. Or instead of, if you've got already into contraction, then you've got to come back to curiosity. Or if you went to frustration, come back to fascination. There's little bumper sticker phrases if you want to use them. Feel free to make up more and spread them around if it helps humans.
And that works both internally and interpersonally.
Yeah.
And so that sense of the loss of touch with ourselves, I think for most of us what happens is we lose touch with ourselves because of a narrowing or a constricting of our perspective. And I think that's true with interpersonal as well as intrapersonal.
Yeah. Any questions or comments right now from anybody? Yes?
Maybe just tips for accessing that, 'cause I totally hear what you're saying, and I'm excited by it, and I realize that when the anger hits, or when that fight emotion is aroused for me, accessing not just curiosity, but like genuine curiosity is challenging.
You may need to leverage in some quasi or semi curiosity to start with, right? It's just the acting as if thing, right? That you get into the habit of doing the thing. So I have this sort of these infamous 3 questions. What is this? Where did it come from? What do I want to do with it? And I assign it to my clients when they have a feeling arise within them. What is this? And take the time to think about it a little bit. You may not come up with an answer, but just asking the question has already changed your state of mind. And then where did it come from, or / what do I know about it? Exploring that. Sometimes you don't get the answer to the first one until you get to the second one. So where did it come from? Oh, I'll see. Well, I'm angry. Okay. Well, why am I angry? Where'd that come from? Oh, I know.
It was her fault.
it was when she fill in the blank, or when he fill in the blank. Okay. Well, wait a second. When she said that, that hurt my feelings. So maybe that's not really anger. All right, and that you've shifted your state of mind. And then the third question, which none of us have been taught to ask about our emotions, is what do I want to do with it? We don't treat our emotional experience as if it's something we get to choose. And yet, I think we do. We're taught, in fact, quite the opposite. We're taught to be a victim to our emotion. If you look at our language, if you think of any context or any phrase wherein we're talking about an emotional state, that probably, if any of them you're thinking of right now, it's likely to be one in which we're a victim or a puppet to our emotions.
Like overcome with sadness.
Overcome, overwhelmed, struck, blinded by, or that's I'd like to say this one. What other context is the word falling considered favorable? Falling in love.
What about when people say they're so sorry? How do you feel about that? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. All day, all the time. Calling yourself sorry. I suppose there could be debates about it, but I don't think I'm sorry as an emotion. But the state of mind that they're in that's producing that sounds like a very depressed person, really, on the outset of that. That's an interesting point. I'm so sorry.
I'm going to talk about forgiveness.
I could probably go off into a tangent with that. But
I'm going to restrain him for a moment here. I wanted to respond to your question also that Jay's suggesting a shift of mind. And sometimes you actually have to shift the body to shift the mind. So if it's fight or flight that you find yourself getting into, a helpful thing to do is to have your head lower than your heart. And to really come down into a pose like that. It's called Prasarita Padottanasana yoga pose, where you can take several deep breath cycles and change your physical perspective, change your body chemistry, your arousal mode, and you might have to stay down long enough to ask the questions from there. Because sometimes if it is interpersonal and we stand back up to re-engage with it, our body posture and our story about the engagement are so strong because the samskaras are neurological, physiological, musculoskeletal. It's in every part of us. So if you shift your posture, and I'm suggesting this one because it's down, we call it down-regulating. Now the person who's thinking they're going to freeze or submit, which is like a collapse response to an emotional thing, I might recommend rather than this, to reconsider and come back to their diaphragm that they do this. And try to stay here until curiosity emerges by changing from freeze submit to something where you're more embodied. You're not collapsing out of the relational despair. You're going to stay present to it. Like if I were, let's say somebody's arguing in bed and they're going to say, oh, forget it, and they roll over in bed like this. That's freeze submit. It's also taking flight. But if that person might decide, okay, I'm going to stay present with this. This isn't my adversary, this is my loved one. I'm going to sit up in bed and take some breaths. Oh, I'm really hating this. What I feel is really frightened, not as angry as I feel frightened. And they might come to some awareness of that and then turn towards the other, who was an adversary and now is an ally. But we actively work in yoga therapy at changing not just the mind position, but the body position to help facilitate some of that. And what is a curious, like if you were to sit like this is a more curious, open-palmed, open-hearted, open gaze expression. And if you sit like this, trying to listen to your partner, it's just not as open. So even just changing your posture that much. Here you reflect more like the Dalai Lama, and you can think thoughts, even thoughts like, as our friend Bessel van der Kolk said during his training, he's like, in this position, can you think the thought, I hate Dick Cheney? He was asking 300 psychologists in the room. The answer was no. It's really hard to think that hate thought when you're in this position. But can you think it from this position? Yeah, you can think it from that position. But, so just changing position even this much. I'm recommending a stronger change of affect and physiology by using a bigger position, but sometimes all you have is this. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think your question is relevant also. I'm going to talk a little bit about forgiveness, because I think the overuse of the phrase, I'm so sorry, or like a reflex, like use of it, like I'm sorry, is sometimes premature, because it can cut off the actual engagement that's needed for two people to experience mindful curiosity about themselves and to come back to the expansive possibility that we're about to experience transformation. But I'm sorry, if it's said in a certain way and repetitively, can be like, well, let's just end this. I'm sorry. No, you're sort of dismissing the possibility of awe again and expansiveness. So if we take mindful curiosity as a practice, and that's sort of what Jay was hinting at there with the questions, and I'm suggesting that your body posture also brings you to that, you will evolve into your capacity for empathy. And empathy is self and other. Self-empathy means empathy from you to any aspect of yourself that is inclined to suffer. Empathy from you to those aspects that I call your inner community members, those that are inclined to suffer or feel pain or isolation. Empathy is not just an outside interpersonal thing, it's an intrapersonal inside event too. And our capacity for this builds our capacity for empathy for the other. Likewise, empathy for them builds our capacity for empathy for ourselves. The empathy circuits in your brain, I think this is really fascinating, because babies are born with their right brain and not left brain function yet. And empathy circuits in your brain are in the right hemisphere. Not in the left hemisphere, which is cognitive and intellectual and linear and scientific and logical, and those are all great things. But right brain to right brain co-regulation of empathy builds each person's brain circuits for empathy. And so when the baby's looking up at the mother and she's looking down with oxytocin, which is over here, by the way, the cuddle hormone, the love hormone, is over here activating, and the mother's looking at the baby, right brain to right brain, love and connection and empathy is learned. It's instinctive for us, but it can be learned by looking at facial expressions and feeling them and responding to the facial expressions. If we don't get to develop facial expressions because we might have parents whose affects are flat or consistently hard, or the facial expression might not go with the actual emotion because their facial expressions came from upstream, another generation, and upstream, another generation. So you might have a confused facial expression. We actually can practice developing empathy by changing our facial expressions and remembering how it is to facially express, and again, even if it's first a quasi expression because you're practicing it, to facially express tenderness or understanding. The components of empathy are understanding, tenderness, resonance, attunement, a kind of feeling of, I get how that pain is for you, because I also have the human condition in me. And I've experienced my own sorts of pain. And right now, ours are vibrating together. And that vibration builds your empathy networks. Again, it's like understanding and tenderness, resonance, I get you, and I get you getting me, and that feels so much better. And attunement. I get you, and I get you getting me, and I don't mind that we're having this experience, so I don't turn away from it. I don't have to close it down or slough it off or joke about it right now. I get you getting me, and I'm okay staying in that mirrored, attuned place. Just long enough to stretch my capacity for empathy, and thank you for being my mirror for this opportunity. Because then you can shine that empathy inwardly towards yourself as well. And what we empathize with is primarily the vulnerability and turbulence of the human condition. And that practice enough actually falls into, pardon me for using the word fall, falls into, on this spectrum, forgiveness and freedom. And by forgiveness and freedom, what I mean here is we forgive ourselves for our vulnerability and susceptibility to the seeds of human suffering, expressed as our own unskillful actions and expressed in the unskillful actions of others. Forgiveness doesn't condone behavior. And it doesn't come before mindful curiosity and empathy. Forgiveness doesn't say, I agree with that behavior. It doesn't mean that reparations aren't needed. Forgiveness is like forgiving the earnestness and the foibles of our human nature. And it frees us not to have to be bound to that samskaric pattern again and again. Forgiving ourselves for the pain we've caused to ourselves, or even forgiving ourselves for the pain we inadvertently caused to others. If we've gone through the stages like this, that forgiveness is wholehearted, and it frees you from having to act in the same unskillful ways. Do you trust what I'm saying? How many of you struggle with the concept of forgiveness? We should have started earlier tonight.
Forgiveness is a big one. It's a commitment to, it's an explicit commitment, hopefully, to the notion that the relationship you have is more important than whatever the slight was. Fundamentally, that's what you're saying to this person, or to yourself about the person. This is not as important to me as a relationship.
When it's in our relationship to ourselves, this is in my book also, I call it not self-abandoning. Forgiveness shows up as a radical commitment to not self-abandon. That is, to not vacate yourself, to not abandon your own needs, to not abandon your own goodness on behalf of holding resentment or criticism towards yourself instead. So forgiveness is also not abandoning the possibility of the relationality being a place for transformation, rather than continued hurt and unskillfulness. Okay, those of you who raised your hand, are you trusting it as a concept any bit more? Are we talking you into it? Well, let me say it differently. What are you thinking when we say, do you feel your brain spazzing out? Are you saying, yeah, but?
I was just thinking how easy it is to slide into something like pity instead of forgiveness.
Yes. Yeah. So our Dharma talks are on the internet. You can listen to them. And the Brahma Viharas, which I listed here, has been already given as a Dharma talk pretty recently. And the near enemy for compassion is pity, which is like a disguise of compassion, but it's not really compassion because it has this condescension or hierarchy to it. And so if you go to pity, the way this matrix works is if you fall into pity and you think, oh, I could have gone to forgiveness, come back to compassion. Oh, I'm having compassion for myself right now because I went to pity. And can I have compassion for the other who's experiencing me judging them? And through the Brahma Viharas, you also come back to forgiveness and freedom. Do you understand the responsibility in that?
Yes.
I just hit a nerve there, didn't I?
I have a little trick for that one too, to use the actual definition of pity. To remind yourself when you're feeling pity instead of compassion, remind yourself the actual definition, not the common use, but the actual definition in Oxford English Dictionary is sympathy and compassion sympathy and concern aroused by the suffering or misfortune of another. That's the definition of pity.
Sympathy and
radically
concern.
different from the way the word is commonly used. And so I've used that as a little, when you find that if you are feeling pity, remind yourself, wait a second. The real meaning of pity is actually synonymous with empathy or sympathy. Both.
Sympathy and concern aroused by the suffering or misfortune of another. Now that can pull you from pity as the near enemy back to compassion as the clear bell of the human heart. The far enemy of compassion is cruelty, which we get more likelihood if we're caught up in the biological imperative. We'll go to the far enemies of these Brahma Viharas. And again, that's a different Dharma talk that we have recorded. And I'll do that Dharma talk again, so you can also come to hear it live and in person. But these practices take us to forgiveness and freedom. And that's also what's offered on this side of the spectrum over here. Thank you for your your comment and for the exchange and the little light bulb that went on over your head. Any other reactions to the concept of forgiveness? Yes.
I'm hearing that anger towards somebody else's behavior or towards behavior of your own behavior that isn't actually right for you or the situation. I'm hearing that anger about those things isn't okay. I'm hearing it's like I'm missing something because I'm jumping to forgiveness. Like rather than feeling anger, I'm going to forgive.
I think you are missing a step there, because when anger gets aroused, there's a few possibilities going on. One is that and this goes back to your question, like how do we practice? If your biological system is already overwhelmed or depleted or frazzled or anxious and we get triggered, so one recommendation we make here is keep your resilience high. Keep your gas tank full. Keep your well-being as a high priority, because you'll be less reactive in general. So let's say anger arises. Well, there's a biological component. A second component might be somebody just crossed your boundaries and your threat system actually feels the need to protect, guard, and push back against. So that's a way anger can show up. But it can also show up as, I suddenly feel devalued. My threat system just told me I might get rejected, abandoned, annihilated, left behind. The tribe won't keep caring for me. So at a primitive level, you've got this surge going on. Now, if we look at anger and if you take one of those paint chips, you go to the paint store and it's got like the lightest hue and then the darkest hue on the bottom. You take the paint chip and turn it like this. Anger's on the top. So if you want to lessen the coloring of anger, you start with mindful curiosity. Lessening the coloring is a yoga phrase we use from the Yoga Sutras. It means lessen the coloring of the samskaras until they're less and less dense. They have less power over you. So let's say here I'm going to be curious. And I might get curious physiologically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. Probably as I dial down the coloring, I'm going to move from anger or rage to frustration, irritation, and I might keep going down further and realize my sense of vulnerability or helplessness. Maybe there's betrayal and it pops me back up to the darker colors. No, it's not. I feel my vulnerability. No, they betrayed me. It's so uncomfortable to get to the helplessness and the vulnerability that is actually, as we were born, helpless and vulnerable to the care and provision from others. And this just got assaulted in your system. So if you are biologically more resilient on a certain day, it might not go as deep or trigger as high. So consider that and forgive yourself for being down on your resilience. Or if it was an affront to your boundaries, and maybe you saw that coming but you weren't setting clear boundaries for months and months, and then it got affronted and here it is, now it's too big to ignore and I'm enraged. Well, forgive yourself for noticing previously but not acting on. Because from the state, going down through this, of forgiveness and freedom, you will respond more wisely than from the state of self-criticism or self-condemnation or denial or suppression or rejection of what you're experiencing.
So anger as an opportunity for forgiveness in a way.
Yes, absolutely, but going through the stages like this
Right.
to realize that there's quite likely many nuances under that anger for you, and I would say that hypothetically the common ground for all of us is helplessness at the bottom. Like look at a 2-year-old's rage. Does your anger ever feel like that? Yeah. You are not alone. This is the laughter of recognition.
That's the victim relationship we have to the emotion too. We have a little different perspective on that. We don't have time to get into it, but I don't see anger as being a bad thing, a negative thing at all. I think it's just as good and useful and helpful as love or happiness or anything else.
Well, that's not different from my perspective.
No, from the way that we've been talking about it. But
just
it's
clarifying.
our ignorance and our helplessness and the victim relationship we have to that ignorance that we fall prey to very primitive expressions of the anger. That's why we want to get away from it. The anger's bad, it's all bad, make it all go away, It's not a good thing. Everything about it is bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that almost guarantees that we're going to continue to be ignorant in our relationship
Mm-hmm.
to it. And it will continue to be worse than poorly wielded. It will be wielded in a very damaging way. Will be taken over by it.
Yeah.
Until relatively recently, I discovered from an attorney client of mine, I'd used for years this example, but he told me that they changed the law. It was where our victim relationship with emotions was actually institutionalized in law as a crime of passion. If we could show that we had really strong emotions, at the time that we committed the crime, they would give us a break on our sentence. It's like, institutionalizing it. But so in the meantime, however, there's oftentimes it's a secondary emotion too. It ends up being, without some exploration of it within ourselves, it's very likely it's going to end up being a counterproductive, maladaptive reaction we have to it.
And it's something to consider there is how much prejudice we have in our world against anger and the expression of anger. So that when it arises, we have the likelihood of a few really serious ways to judge ourselves. One of those is, this isn't an acceptable human emotion and I'm experiencing it. Really big. And another is, and now I'm not living my spiritual values. I'm not living the values that I learned in yoga, for example, or my basic personal values. Because now I feel rage and I want to hurt something or somebody. And so those two places to seriously judge ourselves, you can just add fuel to the fire and take off. And it might be a place to practice mindful curiosity, empathy for ourselves that anger is so prejudiced against and I'm experiencing it right now. What is this like to feel? I'm in that sector of the human experience that people would really judge me for. Or empathy for the ways in which sometimes it's hard to live our spiritual values. And then forgiveness for the fact that that arose, and then we move more skillfully in relationship to it. And if we can't forgive ourselves, we can practice forgiving the way that anger has shown up on the planet for eons and all the destruction that it's done. And that is a whole other Dharma talk. That's a Tonglen meditation practice and more Tibetan Buddhism and looking at the intersection of compassion, rage, and forgiveness. And if
Are you saying that when people get angry, they beat themselves up about it, or they feel bad about it?
Yes. And they might more easily forgive somebody else on the planet or the phenomena on the planet than they could forgive themselves. So if you are struggling to practice forgiveness for self, you might start with the global experience of how people feel sad. Do I forgive humans for feeling sad? Or for somebody personal in your life that you might be able to extend forgiveness towards them, which kind of nudges you in the direction of forgiveness for yourself. Same thing with anger. If I could forgive somebody else's angry outburst because I can see that they were anxious, overwhelmed, underfed, underslept, and not enough community support and mental health issues, and I can forgive that for them. The seeds of that forgiveness are available to me also. And it is the case that we have to sometimes practice on the other before we can offer it to ourselves. Don't leave yourself out. Okay, one more question, Tina.
I wrote a Dharma code about a year ago, and forgive was in the code and out the code, and I kept putting it in, taking it out, putting it. And my issue was I kept going through the process of forgive, and when you're not forgiving, forgive yourself for not forgiving. And I was like I couldn't. It was just this. I was like, it was blowing my mind. I was like, how is this going to work? It did end up in my code, and which is to grow, to give, to forgive, and love. Those 4 words. And it started off as a big, soup of words, but it kind of reduced down to those 4 words. But it was just 3 because that forgive was the toughest one. It really was.
Yeah.
And certain people would come up and pick literally their faces every time I put it back in my code, and then I take it out again and then put it back. But that was it. That process of going through forgive and forgive yourself when you don't forgive others
Mm-hmm.
was really a tough concept for me to really understand and
Mm-hmm.
forgive myself. Or,
Yeah.
you know, but it's definitely a huge part of that.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
So what you might do if you look at the Brahma Viharas here, let's say that you were mindfully curious about the struggle that you're facing with forgiveness, and that's understandable. And you want to cultivate greater self-empathy and forgiveness, but you take a little detour. That's why this is a reciprocity sign here. You might pick up the Brahma Vihara called loving kindness, and practice loving kindness towards the part of you that is struggling with forgiveness, from the part of you that understands forgiveness. So you're offering really specifically to an aspect of yourself that is struggling, from an aspect of yourself that already knows, that already understands. And so it becomes very interpersonal.
Yeah.
And that frees you to experience empathy for the part of you that was struggling, and then forgiveness as a natural evolution of that empathy. And then the freedom not to cause the same human dilemmas again, because we do participate in those dilemmas.
Yeah, the pattern.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Lincoln?
Well, as you're talking, a couple of curiosities, a couple of reflections come up right in the field. One is that to our identified self, having anger would mean we would lose our attachment relationship.
Yes.
And interesting enough, and the word forgive is the need to be given or forgiveness, and perhaps we haven't gotten what we needed in some way.
Mm-hmm.
What's curious to me is that forgiveness perhaps straddles both the spiritual and the biological.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of, because there's a way from a survival perspective, there might be good cause not to forgive. Then on a spiritual level, perhaps we're able to kind of come into that. So in other words, awareness itself is able to acknowledge forgiveness.
Yeah.
But to the survival brain, that would be a deal breaker.
Well, and sometimes forgiveness to the survival brain is needed right there in the moment, because you might be hating each other, but you've got to forgive because the house is on fire and we got to get the cats and the kids out.
Yes.
Right. Or the kids and then the cats. I'm sorry. Our kids, they walk on their own, so it's our cats that don't move so well anymore. We would actually be picking up the pets with our teenagers. So let's share a few moments of silence together in honor of the enthusiasm you've had this evening, and to bring ourselves back to grounding. So. And I will recommend you take just a couple deep breath cycles to internalize, metabolize, appreciate that you've been here and present. And with appreciation for your effort to be here and everyone's contributions, please bring your hands into Anjali Mudra. May all beings be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May all beings know love and peace. May all beings experience joy and harmony. May we and all beings everywhere be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May we and all beings everywhere experience love and joy and peace and harmony. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.